There's a kind of endurance that the land recognizes before people do. It shows up in the way a woman walks a fence line at 4 in the morning, not because anyone told her to, but because the cattle need water by 5 and the pump handle has been broken for 6 days, and she is the only one who knows which angle makes it catch. The land notices these things. People take longer. Dylan Voss had ridden the high country above the Powder River Basin for 22 years, and he had learned to read the land the way other men read law books, slowly, with attention to the parts that didn't announce themselves. What he found on the east edge of his water survey that Thursday in October was not what he expected. The property sat low against the ridge, the way small homesteads did when their builders were more concerned with wind protection than visibility. 2 structures, a cabin and a lean-to barn, both standing, both intact enough to suggest recent work rather than slow abandonment. The fence along the north run was patched in 3 places with different wire gauges, the kind of repair that happens over years, not seasons. The yard had been raked, not for appearance, for function, the kind of raking that kept mud from tracking into a workspace. He stopped his horse on the ridgeline and looked for a long moment. Then he saw the roof. Someone had replaced half the shingles on the cabin with fresh-cut pine boards, the wood still pale against the weathered gray of the original. The work was clean. The lines were even. It was the work of someone who understood geometry, or had learned it the hard way. Dylan dismounted and told himself it was to check the creek boundary marker. He knew that was partly true and partly not. The woman was on the south side of the barn when he came around the corner, and she did not startle. She was fitting a new braceboard to a gate hinge, a mallet in one hand and a wood screw in the other, and she looked up at him with the level assessment of someone who had learned to calculate strangers quickly and accurately. "You're off the county trail," she said. "Water survey," Dylan said. "Powder River Basin. I follow the east tributary. The tributary runs through my land for about 80 yards. I know it." She set down the mallet but kept the screw, not a threat. "Inventory. Luella Crane," she said. Dion Voss. She knew the name. He could see it register. The slight adjustment in her posture, the recalibration, but she didn't let it change her face much. Good. He had dealt with enough people who let his name do their thinking for them. "Running stock?" he asked. "I had 12 head. Sold 8 to hold the deed through last winter. The 4 I kept are grazing the north pasture." She said it the way people state weather facts, without apology, without the downward cast of someone asking for sympathy, just the arithmetic of where things stood. He understood that arithmetic. The drought years had pressed hard on the small operations along this stretch of Wyoming. The big ranches had reserves, water rights lined up like savings accounts, and cash enough to wait out a bad season. The small homesteads had only will and whatever they'd managed to put by. When the choice came down to the animals or the land usually won, because land could be worked again come spring. Animals sold in a drought market came back at triple the price. "How long has the east gate been off its runner?" he asked. She blinked once. Then, "Since July. Ground shifted after the dry spell. I've been working back from the cabin outward." Logical order. "It's the order that keeps the rain out of the place I sleep." He nodded. He walked to the east gate and looked at the runner track. The ground had heaved about 2 inches, frost damage from the prior winter finally working its way up. He could see where she'd shimmed the post with flat stones to compensate. The shims were level. Whoever had taught her right. "Your post work is solid," he said. "My father's post work is solid," she said. "I'm maintaining what he built." He looked at her then, really looked, the way you look at a deed before you sign it. She was perhaps 28, with the kind of steadiness in her hands that comes from years of physical work, not just weeks of desperation. The roof, the shims, the raked yard, these were not the acts of someone in crisis. These were the acts of someone running a long calculation with very careful margins. "I'd like to look at the creek boundary," he said. "The east tributary splits about 40 yards up. There's a question about which branch counts for water rights." "The southern branch," she said. "I have the original survey from 1881. My father filed it himself in Casper. I'd like to see it." She looked at him for a moment, then she set the wood screw in her coat pocket and walked toward the cabin. He followed. The document was in a flat cedar box on a shelf above the cold hearth, wrapped in oilcloth with the precise care of something consulted regularly. She unwrapped it on the table and smoothed it flat with her palm, and Dylan looked at the original survey lines, the hand-drawn branch marks, the county recorder's stamp from Natrona County, October 1881. She was right. The southern branch was the registered water source. "You've had this argument before," he said. "With the Aldrich operation," she said. 3 years ago, they grazed their herd up to the northern branch and started calling it the same tributary. It isn't. My father's survey is clear." "Eldridge backed off?" "Eldridge's attorney backed off when I showed him this." She touched the corner of the document. "Men like Aldridge don't read their own surveys. They assume that if they say something loudly enough, it becomes true." Dylan said nothing. He had known 3 men like Aldridge in his life and had done business with all of them. He knew the pattern exactly. He rewrapped the survey himself, carefully, and set it back in the cedar box. She made no offer of coffee or conversation. He didn't expect one. When he left, he told her he might send a crew to look at the tributary split to clarify the boundary markers for the county record. "Send them to the south bank," she said. "That's where the markers are." He rode the long way back to his ranch, which he almost never did. He was thinking. The tributary work took 2 days. He sent 3 men, his best surveyor, a fence hand, and the foreman, Chet, who had 20 years of water rights experience and the good sense to listen before he talked. When they arrived at the Crane property at first light, Luella was already at the creek bank with a copy of the 1881 survey and a marking stick she'd cut herself. Chet sent Dylan a note that evening. It said, "She knew the property better than the survey did. We just confirmed what she'd already mapped." Dylan read it twice, then a third time. He rode out himself the next morning, ostensibly to review the markers before they were filed with the county. He found Luella on the north fence, replacing a section of wire that had snapped under a fallen branch. She was working with a fence stretcher she'd rigged from a wagon axle pin and a length of chain. Not standard equipment, not something you'd find in a supply catalog. The kind of improvised tool that comes from solving a problem you've already solved 20 times. "That rig works," he said. "It works on this wire gauge," she said. "Heavier than 60 would snap the chain." "Where'd you learn it?" "Necessity." He got down from his horse and held the near post while she cranked the stretcher. They worked the section in 20 minutes. Neither said much. There are people you can work beside in silence without the silence becoming a problem, and Luella Crane was one of them. When they finished, she stepped back and looked at the line, straight and tight. "I want to make you a proposal," Dylan said. She looked at him. "Not the fence?" "My south herd needs the east tributary pasture for spring movement. 8 weeks, March through April, 600 head. I'd pay fair market rate for the grazing rights and the water access. In exchange, I'll send a crew to bring that barn to full working condition before the first freeze." She was quiet for a moment, not hesitating, thinking. There's a difference, and he had learned to recognize it. "What's fair market for that pasture?" He named a number. She named a higher one, with the calm of someone who had looked up comparable rates, which he had. He agreed without negotiating. It was a fair number. The fact that she knew it was a fair number told him more than the number itself. "I'd want it in writing," she said, "with a clause specifying no creek bank disturbance within 10 yards of the survey markers." "I'll add a drainage provision," he said. "Heavy cattle traffic on a creek crossing degrades the bank in 2 seasons without management. I'll include it. It protects you." She looked at him for a long time, not suspiciously, carefully, the look of someone determining whether accuracy was an accident or a habit. "I'll read it before I sign it," she said. "I'd expect nothing less." He had the contract drawn up that evening and wrote it out himself the next morning. She read every word at the kitchen table, the cedar box open beside her, the 1881 survey unrolled for reference. She asked 2 questions. Both were good questions. He answered them directly. She signed. He witnessed. "The barn crew will be here Monday," he said. "I'll be here," she said. November came in hard, the way Wyoming Novembers did, with a cold that had opinions about everything. The barn work took 5 days. Luella worked alongside the crew from the first hour of the first morning, not supervising. Working, she knew where every rafter sat, which joists had softened, which boards were original pine, and which had been replaced in her father's time. The crew foreman, a taciturn man named Webb, watched her for half the first morning and then simply started deferring to her on questions of sequence. By day 3, the conversation between them had the shorthand of people who'd worked together for months. On the 4th afternoon, Dillon rode out to check progress. He stood at the barn door and watched Luella and Webb debate the angle of a new support beam with the focused disagreement of 2 people who both cared about getting it right. Webb lost the argument. The beam went in at Luella's angle. That evening, Dillon sat on the porch rail and told her what he'd seen. "Webb doesn't lose arguments about lumber," he said. "He does when he's wrong," she said. He smiled. She didn't see it because she was looking out at the repaired fence line, the barn with its new face, the creek boundary markers freshly painted white against the early dark. "This place is going to be something," he said. "Not flattery, observation." "It already is something," she said. "It was not defensive. It was precise." She was right about that, too. The trouble arrived on a Tuesday, 3 weeks into November, on a roan horse with silver stamped saddle leather that had no practical use and a great deal of decorative intent. The rider was a broad man in a town coat, clean hands, clean boots, the particular polish of someone who made his living convincing people to sign things. His name was Everett Noon, and Luella knew it before he introduced himself. Everett Noon worked the distressed property circuit between Cheyenne and Casper, and he was good at it, the way a river is good at finding low ground, not through effort, but through the patient exploitation of gravity. He had acquired 14 properties in Johnson County in the past 3 years, most of them from women whose husbands had died of weather or accident or sickness, who were behind on taxes, who did not know that the offer they were being given was roughly half what the land was worth, and the terms they were signing included a right of first refusal clause that made selling to anyone else for 5 years nearly impossible. Everett Newen did not break laws. He simply understood that most people do not read what they sign when they are frightened enough. He pulled up at the gate with the comfortable confidence of a man who expected the door to open. "Miss Crane," he said, "I've been authorized to make a serious offer on this property. Cash sale, quick close." He named a number. Luella leaned on her fence post. "The property is under a water rights and grazing lease agreement, notarized and filed with Natrona County. Leaseholder is Dillon Voss." The smile didn't move, but the eyes behind it recalculated. "Leases are temporary arrangements," he said. "A property like this, in this condition, you could be comfortable in town. No more fence repairs in November." "I like November," Luella said. "The offer is generous given the current market." "The current market puts this land at considerably more than what you've named." "I know, because I looked it up in Casper last month." She kept her voice level. "Not hostile. Informational. I'm not selling. You're welcome to ride back the way you came." Everett Noon did not ride back the way he came. He tucked his document away slowly, with the theatrical patience of a man making a point. "I'll give you time to consider," he said. "Properties under lease have a way of running into complications. I'll be back in 2 weeks." He rode out. Luella watched him go. Then she went inside and wrote in the property ledger, known E. November 14, offer declined. Stated intention to return. Threat implied regarding lease complications. She sent a rider to Dillon that afternoon. He arrived the following evening, quietly, with Chet and 2 other men. No announcement, no drama. The way serious people handle serious problems before they become larger ones. He found Luella at the kitchen table with the cedar box open and the 1881 survey flat on the table beside her. The property ledger was open to the entry she'd made. He read it. Then he sat down across from her. "You wrote it down immediately," he said. "The same day. The time and what was said. If this goes to a county dispute, I want a record." He nodded. She had already thought 2 steps ahead. He shouldn't have been surprised. "He'll be back in 2 weeks," she said. He implied the lease was a complication he could resolve. "He can imply what he likes," Dillon said. "The lease is filed and registered. What he means is that if the situation became difficult enough, a woman alone might decide the paper wasn't worth the trouble." "He's miscalculated the woman," she said. "He has," Dillon said, significantly. They sat for a moment in the quiet particular to 2 people who have decided, without saying it out loud, that they are handling something together. "I'll be here when he comes back," Dillon said. "You don't have to be," she said, not turning him away. Testing the offer. "My lease agreement runs through this property. What happens here is my business." He paused. "Also, I'd like to be here." She looked at him. Something shifted in her expression. Not warmth exactly, but a more precise kind of attention. "2 weeks then," she said. Noon arrived on a Wednesday late morning with 2 riders whose stillness suggested they were hired for presence rather than cattle work. He pulled up at the south fence line, where the new post stood clean and straight in the cold ground, and found Dillon there and Chet and Luella, 6 feet to Dillon's left with her arms at her sides and her father's colt at her hip. She had not worn it for show. She wore it because her father had taught her to carry what she might need, and that day she had decided she might need it. Noan took in the scene with the unhurried read of a man who assessed situations for a living. "Boss," he said, "didn't expect to see you personally." "This tributary falls inside my leased pasture," Dillon said. "What happens on this property is my business. Miss Crane and I have an ongoing conversation about a potential transaction." "The transaction is decline," Luella said. Her voice carried across the cold field without effort. "It was declined the first time you came. It's declined now. The next time you ride onto this land without an invitation, I'll have the county sheriff here with a copy of everything I've written down about your visits." She looked at him steadily, both times. Noan held her gaze for a long moment. Then he looked at Dillon, measuring, calculating. Then at Chet. Then at the 2 men behind them, who had the particular stillness of people who had been in situations like this before and found them unremarkable. He looked back at Luella. She had not moved. He touched the brim of his hat, turned his horse, and rode. The sound of hooves faded into the cold morning air. Nobody said anything for a moment. Then Chet, who rarely commented on anything that wasn't directly related to cattle, said quietly, "That's the first time I've seen Noan leave without the paperwork." Dillon looked at Luella. She was already walking back toward the cabin. Word traveled in that county, the way word does in country where people live close to the land and pay attention to what happens on it. By the end of the following week, 2 neighboring homesteaders had ridden to the Crane property to ask about Noan, specifically whether the rumors were true, that he'd ridden away from a signed confrontation without so much as a counteroffer. The rumors were true. A woman named Ada Prentice, who ran a small cattle operation 12 miles east, arrived on a Thursday afternoon with a tin of molasses cookies and a story about a document Noan had sent her 2 months prior. She'd signed it before she understood the right of first refusal clause. Luella read the document, found the clause on page 3 in language designed to be overlooked, and wrote Ada a letter she could take to the county recorder in Casper. Ada cried briefly in the kitchen, then stopped, then ate 3 cookies and asked if Luella had ever thought about forming a kind of informal land association, neighbors who shared document review, who could identify patterns in the way distressed property agents worked the county. Luella said she had thought about it more than once. The county land recorder, a careful man named Silas Prout, stopped Dillon outside his office in Douglas 3 weeks later. "Heard Noan left the Crane place empty-handed," Silas said. "He did." Silas shook his head slowly. "You understand what you've done, filing that lease. Any speculator who looks at the county register is going to see your name on that paperwork. They'll move to properties without protection first. That's the intention, Dylan said. Silas looked at him over his spectacles. Most men with your resources would have bought the parcel. She didn't want to sell. No, Silas said. He was quiet for a moment, looking at his ledger. She didn't? He said it plainly, without ceremony. But plain things land differently when they are also true. Dylan rode out to the Crane property that afternoon and told Luella what Silas had said. She was at the creek bank, completing the drainage deflector she'd been building from branch and rock, a low-tech but precise piece of bank management that had taken her 4 afternoons. She listened without stopping work. He's right, she said, about the effect. She set a stone with care. Thank you, Dylan. It was the first time she'd used his given name. He noticed and didn't make anything of it, which was the right decision. December settled in earnest. The creek froze from the edges inward, the way all things freeze, at the margins first, then slowly toward the moving center. Dylan's cattle crossed twice a week, careful and measured, and Luella tracked every crossing in the property ledger: water level, ice condition, bank compression. She sent the notes to Dylan in brief, factual reports. He replied with equally brief notes that added context: what the grazing pattern upstream looked like, where the herd was moving next week, whether the volume would increase or decrease. It was a correspondence of working facts. It was, without either of them naming it, also something else. He came himself on the 3rd Thursday to check the crossing before the heaviest movement of the season. He found her crouching at the bank, pressing her palm flat against a section of compressed soil near the main crossing point. Here, she said, without looking up, and 4 yards east, the approach is too direct. You need a curve in the approach path, something that slows the lead animals and distributes the weight before they hit the bank. He crouched beside her. She was right. The technique existed. Experienced ranchers across the territory had developed it on high-traffic crossings, the kind of practical knowledge that lived in people because it hadn't been worth anyone's while to write it down. These reports, he said, everything you're documenting, the ice behavior, the bank response, the load distribution, in 10 years, whoever works this land will know exactly how this crossing behaves in winter. That's the point, she said. Most people don't think 10 years out when they're working on margins. She stood and looked at the crossing. My father thought 30 years out. He filed that survey in 1881, thinking about the next owner and the one after that. She paused. The land deserves that kind of thinking. They stood beside each other at the creek bank, and the cold was deep and clarifying. Miss Crane, he said, in the register he used to begin a negotiation, but slower and with more care, I'd like to discuss whether what exists between us might take a different form. She looked at him, not away, not at the water, at him. You're talking about more than the lease, she said. I am. She didn't answer immediately. She never answered anything that deserved consideration with anything less than consideration. That was one of the things he had understood about her since October. She answered 3 days later, on a Monday morning with frost still on the creek grass, riding to his ranch without announcement and finding him at the supply barn taking inventory. She tied her horse at the post and walked to where he stood with a clipboard, and he set the clipboard down. I have conditions, she said. Something moved through his expression, quiet, attentive. The Crane deed stays registered in my name. My father's survey stays in the cedar box in my cabin. I manage the East Pasture and Creek records. That knowledge lives with me. Agreed. I'm not an ornament. If I'm part of what you're building, I'm part of it in the way I've been part of this land, working it, understanding it, having a say in what happens to it. He looked at her steadily. I told Shed after the first week that you knew that property better than any survey did. I've known what I was looking at since October. The silence between them held more than either of them had words for at that moment. Then we're agreed, she said. He extended his hand. She shook it, the same firm, clean grip as the first time they'd worked a fence together, the same clarity of someone who had read every clause and found the terms sound. Spring came the way Wyoming springs always do, grudgingly then all at once. The creek ran fast and cold with snowmelt. The drainage deflector Luella had built from branch and stone held the bank through the first heavy runoff. The new barn roof shed water without a gap. The fence line, all of it, the original sections and the new, stood straight through the frost heave. On the first page of the spring ledger, in Luella's careful handwriting, the property heading had changed. Boss Crane Ranch, Natrona County, Wyoming, spring 1887. She was turning the first garden row of the season, beans rotating off the winter rye, when she heard Dylan's horse come into the yard. She looked up. He walked to the garden edge. "Beans again," he said. "Beans and then squash. Ground needs it after rye." Sound decision. They stood in the early spring light, two people who had built something carefully, not out of rescue, not out of sentiment, but out of the recognition that some things hold together better with two sets of hands that both know what they're doing. There is a kind of wealth that doesn't announce itself with a town coat and a silver-stamped saddle. It doesn't announce itself at all. It shows up in a drainage deflector built from creek stone on a cold November afternoon in a survey filed in 1881 by a man who thought about the people who would come after him. In an agreement made in the cold outside a supply barn, conditions stated plainly, hands shaken clean. Boss Crane Ranch, 320 acres, registered jointly, permanent. The 1881 survey was still in the cedar box, still in the cabin, still wrapped in oilcloth, not because either of them needed to check it anymore, but because some documents earn their place not by being consulted, but by being kept. Both of them knew exactly what it was worth and exactly where it was, and that was enough. You've been riding with shadows of the Deep West, where these stories live as close to the ground as the people who made them. Tell me where you're watching from. I read every single one. The next story is already waiting. I keep coming back to the moment Luella shook Dylan's hand the second time. Not the first time, when they were strangers, but the second time when they both knew exactly what they were agreeing to. Same grip, same clarity. No performance in it at all. And I think about what it took for a woman in 1886 Wyoming to get to that moment. Not luck, not rescue, a specific combination of things she had been building, quietly, long before anyone showed up to notice. What strikes me most about Luella is that she never stopped thinking clearly. The 1881 survey in the cedar box, she didn't keep that out of sentimentality. She kept it because she understood that knowledge is the thing that holds when everything else gives. When Everett Noon rode up with his clean boots and his rehearsed smile and his document designed to be misread, she wasn't rattled. She knew the comparable land values in Casper because she'd looked them up. She knew the right of first refusal clause because she was the kind of person who reads to page 3. That's not luck either. That's the habit of a mind that refuses to be caught unprepared. I think about how often people in hard situations hand their power away not because they're weak, but because they never built the habit of understanding what they're signing. Luella had built that habit. It saved her land. And then there's the endurance part, the thing that's hardest to talk about because it looks, from the outside, like ordinary stubbornness. Getting up before the cold to rake a yard, nobody compliments. Shimming a post with flat stones because the ground shifted and the gate won't close, and you're the only one there to fix it. Replacing half a roof, one board at a time, working outward from the place you sleep. That kind of persistence doesn't announce itself, it just accumulates. Until one day a man rides up and looks at what you've built and understands, without needing it explained, that he is looking at someone serious. What I think people miss about the story is that Dylan didn't change Luella's situation. She had already changed it. He added protection. Yes, the lease, the crew, the presence at the south fence when no one came back, but the conditions she named before she agreed to anything. The deed stays in my name. I manage the East pasture records. I'm not an ornament. Those weren't the conditions of someone who'd been rescued. Those were the conditions of someone who had always known her own worth and was simply now negotiating from a position of proof. That's the part that stays with me. How the choices you make when nobody's watching, the survey you keep, the record you maintain, the fence you fix in November when you didn't have to, become the foundation of everything that follows. Not because the universe is keeping a ledger, but because character compounds. The work you do quietly shapes what you're capable of when the moment arrives that actually matters. Luella Crane didn't get a fair outcome because she deserved one. She got it because she had spent years becoming someone who could hold the ground long enough to reach it. The 1881 survey is still in the cedar box. That's the detail I can't let go of. A man filed that document thinking about the person who would come after him, and then the person who came after him kept it for the same reason. And that chain of careful thinking, that refusal to stop at what's immediately useful, protected 320 acres of Wyoming ground across 2 generations. Some things hold not because they're lucky, but because someone, somewhere, decided they were worth the trouble of keeping.